Welcome to this third day of summer school. I am Ursula Costantini, Economic Affairs Officer at UNCTAD Globalization Development Strategies Division, which together with the YSI INET organizes this summer school. Welcome to this sixth panel of the summer school titled Demand-Led Growth and Income Distribution. As a distinguished speaker, we have Professor Michalis Nikiforos, who is an associate professor in the Department of History, Economics and Society at the University of Geneva since 2020. He was before at the Levin Institute and Bard College, also teaching economics. And he will talk to us about his work and his research interest about demand-led growth and how that very theoretical work can be applied and becomes extremely important also when it comes to the type of work that institutions like UNCTAD do. And so thank you very much, Michalis, for being here. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ursula. Good morning, everybody. It's always a bad thing to speak in the morning of a summer school because usually people are hungover and they cannot pay much attention. So I hope you can bear with me for the next 40 minutes or so. Okay, so I was asked to talk about demand-led growth and income distribution. So I have prepared some slides, and I would like to provide a general overview of this approach and why this approach. I think it's interesting to have an approach that focuses on an autonomous role for demand and also takes seriously income distribution into account, and how this approach can also be like an entry point for analysis of specific concrete issues when it comes to economic policy. So I will provide the general overview of this approach. I have very, very few references in my presentation, but I have shared some papers with the organizers of the conference. So in case you're interested, you can refer to these papers that they have a quite substantial review of the related literature and the issues that I will be talking about. Okay, so let me start this way. A very important concept in macroeconomics is what Lance Taylor and Frank Lisi in a 1979 paper they called closure. And closure is the direction of macroeconomic causality among different economic variables in a model or a theory. Right? So at an abstract level in macroeconomics, there are two fundamental closure decisions that one needs to make. One is if demand has an autonomous role, right? So if we look at equation one, in a closed economy without government sector, that means if investment on the left-hand side is autonomous from saving or not. And then the second decision is how the income distribution is determined, right? So I will talk about different theories of income distribution. If we start from the neoclassical, so let's have a detour to end up in a demand-led approach. In the neoclassical model answers these two closure questions by saying that demand does not have an autonomous role. So it's the saving that determines the level of investment. And also that income distribution is determined endogenously within the markets based basically on the demand and supply of the different factors of production. So when it comes to labor, the real wage is just the price of labor that is determined in such a way so that the market clears. And therefore, the closure sequence in the neoclassical model is that scarcity, the supply of the different factors of production plus technology, they determine distribution. Distribution is determined endogenously to clear the market. And at the same time, through a production function, they also determine output. And in turn, this determines savings, and then savings determines investment, accumulation, the growth rate, and so on. Right? Now, this closure has some very, very important implications. Like if you want to be consistent with this theory, then the cycle is the result of technological shocks. This is the RBC theory. There is no role for money, debt, and so on, which for some people, and you've heard different talks here, are central to understand a capitalist economy. In this world, money doesn't have any role. There is the so-called classical dichotomy between the real and the financial side of the economy. So employment and real output is not affected by money. It's only nominal variables that are affected. There are important implications for policy analysis. Essentially, this model is telling you, well, let the market do its work. Since the market has a tendency for full employment, then the government does not have any role there, right? If the government tries to intervene, it actually will make things worse. And then it also has very significant implications on how we understand income distribution, right? There is a moral aspect to this story that, you know, if your salary is low, well, it's because your productivity is low, or there are too many of you. That's why your salary is low, right? And that's why there is this famous quote by Bob Lucas from the University of Chicago, who said that of the tendencies that are harmful to sound economics, the most seductive, and in my opinion, the most poisonous, is to focus on questions of distribution, right? So for neoclassical economics, distribution is not a question. And it's not a question because distribution is just the result, the endogenous result of the market. So we shouldn't talk about that. The new Keynesians, as we know, they adopt the same framework, but they introduce a role for demand in the short run using different rigidities. This, you know, allows for a lot of money, a role for policy, but essentially in the long run, the model has the same behavior as the pure neoclassical model, right? Importantly, like if you are a new Keynesian, you have the same fundamental vision. Vision was a word that was used by Schumpeter. Like, how do you understand capitalism at a very fundamental level? So the new Keynesian model at a very fundamental level has the same vision for the capitalist economy. Capitalism is a system that has an endogenous tendency for full employment, full utilization, to produce optimum outcomes, and so on. In the short run, because of the rigidities, then we might have some problems. But essentially, this is the vision of new Keynesians about capitalism. Now, these are all theoretical, but why are they important? Let me show you some nice graphs from Greece. So as some of you might know, Greece had a very big crisis in the previous decade that started in late 2009. In 2010, we had the first adjustment program that was agreed and imposed by the so-called Troika, a body from the IMF, the ECB, and the European Commission. These are the different projections of the Troika, of the different adjustment programs, starting in May 2010, when the first, can you see this? Yes, you can see this little hand. So in May 2010, when the first agreement was signed, this was the projection, right? You would have a shallow recession, but then an eventual recovery. Because of the deep austerity that was imposed, eventually the realized outcomes were much worse. The worse outcomes led to higher government deficits, new rounds of austerity, and so on. So eventually, the real output ended up to fall by 25%, as opposed to the original projections, right? And you see how basically the projections of this model, which is basically a new Keynesian model, Keynesian based on rigidities in the short run, but neoclassical in the long run, they were revised downwards. These are the same, this is the same picture, but the growth rate of GDP. So it's not the level of real GDP, it's the growth rate of real GDP that shows again how big the forecast error was in these projections. However, what is a more fascinating aspect of this graph, apart from the forecast error? So the answer to that is that, well, all the projections you see here, right? You had a complete collapse of the Greek economy. Over 5 years, you had a complete collapse. You have 25% loss in real GDP. But what you see here is that in all these projections, the growth rate within 3 years goes back to 2%, which is what? Which is the supply side determined natural growth rate of the Greek economy, as was estimated by the IMF and these institutions at that time in their DSG model, right? So what I was saying before, it's not purely theoretical, it's actually something that you see in the actual projections of the different institutions that use this theory in their models. That demand plays a role in the long run, but even if you have a complete collapse of an economy, like in the case of Greece, the growth rate keeps going back to its supply side natural growth rate. And this was the case, like you had over the same period after the great financial crisis of 2007, 2009, if you look in different economies around the world, you get similar results, right? So you had a collapse in demand, you had a financial crisis, but the DSG models that were implemented by the IMF or the regional statistical agencies, they were getting the same results, obviously not with the error of that you had in Greece, which was an extreme case. And this is a table here. I don't expect you to read the numbers, but this is how the Congressional Budget Office in the United States reports its results, right? The Congressional Budget Office is one of the main institutions that produces macroeconomic and fiscal forecasts in the United States. So you see here that it's pretty clear that within the first 3 years, so the forecast for the first 3 years are produced with a new Keynesian side of the model. And then in the medium run, the model converges towards the supply side determined outcomes. Talking about the US and talking about the CBO, as I told you in the post-great financial crisis period, the CBO was also projecting that the growth rate of the US economy would go back to its pre-crisis trend. I can see myself here. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay. Now, in the US, that period was also a period of austerity. So what we see here is that these are indices of the real government expenditure in the different recoveries in the US economy in the post-war period. And we see here that the light brown line, which is down here, is the real government expenditure in the US in the last cycle, so after 2009 and until the pandemic. And you see here that it's the only recovery that real government expenditure did not really go back to its level at the beginning of the crisis until 10 years later. This, together with the high indebtedness of the households and so on, and high income inequality, led to this result. So despite this optimistic forecast of the CBO, that real GDP growth would go back to its pre-crisis trend, the result of this austerity, together with these other factors that I mentioned, was that, and this is the black line here, that the previous recovery in the United States was the slowest recovery of the post-war period, right? It's interesting that if you look like the green line or the light blue line that show the recoveries in the 70s, like the stagflation, the so-called stagflation period, the stagflation was way, like the stagnation of that period was way fast, was way more dynamic than what was happening in the last 10 years in the US before the pandemic. The opposite happened with the pandemic. Like the pandemic was dealt in the US and elsewhere with, not with austerity, but with an aggressive fiscal stimulus, right? And we see here that this is the black line in this graph, that if you compare the pace of the recovery in the last 3 years, it's way faster, obviously, compared to what happened in like 15 years ago in the recovery after 2009. And the same is here when it comes to this another graph with the employment population ratio in the United States. And obviously, these graphs, they are economic variables, but behind these economic variables, you know, social issues are hidden. When you have an employment population ratio that does not recover, this has very significant social implications, right? As opposed to what's happening now. So the experience of the fiscal policy during the pandemic and after the pandemic is a testament for the significance of aggregate demand and the role that aggregate demand can have in macroeconomic activity. What about distribution, right? This is a graph that shows the average wage of non-supervisory workers and average productivity in the US economy in the post-war period, right? You see that until the late 70s, the early 80s, the two variables move together. And then they diverge, and you see that real productivity keeps increasing, albeit at a slower pace, but the average wage stagnates. If you take the neoclassical theory of income distribution seriously, the theory that I talked about before, the only way that you can explain that is to say, well, in the early 80s or in the late 70s, you had a break in technology. So until then, you had a Cobb-Douglas production function with the elasticity of substitution equal to 1 that kept the two variables together. And after that, for some reason, the elasticity of substitution became higher than 1, and this led to a faster increase of productivity compared to the real wage, right? So for some unexplained reason, you had this break and this increase in the elasticity of substitution and in the technology of production, right? While if you approach this issue from a political economy point of view, it's very clear, like it's sort of intuitive what happens in the late 70s and the early 80s, right? It's all about the political changes that take place at this time that lead to this increase in income inequality and this faster increase in productivity relative to the real wage after that. The neoclassical theory of distribution also is, it's hard to make sense of international differences in income inequality based on the neoclassical theory of distribution, right? One of the stylized facts of income inequality at the global level is that you have different levels of inequality around the world. And then you also have different trends. So in the last 40 years, more or less all over the Western world, you have an increase in income inequality, but at different levels and different paces. Again, if you believe in the neoclassical model, that means that countries, let's say in Europe, that have lower levels of inequality or where inequality increased at a slower pace, they have access to a very different technology compared to the United States, which again is not very convincing. So again, it's a more convincing story to talk about the different institutional setup of the different economies and the political economy of the different economies in order to explain income inequality and distribution. So another closure, which I think is more convincing compared to the neoclassical, and this brings me now back to the title of my talk, is a closure where demand does have an autonomous role, right? One can go back to classical political economy and discover early seeds of this theory, but it was Keynes and Kalecki in the 30s that they phrased this theory more consistently. And also, it follows the classical theory of distribution. And the classical theory of distribution, again, obviously, it's called classical because it goes back to classical political economy, to Smith, Ricardo, and especially Marx. The classical theory of distribution is telling us that distribution is not fundamentally market determined. It's not fundamentally determined by market variables, but it's determined by social norms, institutions, the class struggle, and things like that, right? And the closure sequence of this closure at a very abstract level, and I will talk later a little bit about how we can go to lower levels of abstraction, is that distribution together with the behavior of the different components of demand leads to the determination of output growth and so on. Again, these ideas go back to classical political economy, to Kalecki, to Steindl, who was a friend and a follower of Kalecki and so on. Contemporary versions of this type of model started developing in the late 70s. An early paper was this paper by Paul Krugman and Lance Taylor. But then you have these other papers by Bob Rawthorne, again, Lance Taylor, Amitav Haddad, Robert Blicker, Heinz Kurz, and you have the Baduri-Marglin model, which is the most famous paper in this literature, right? And this type of model that is based on disclosure has been given different names. It's called Kaleckian, structuralist, post-Keynesian. Because the Baduri-Marglin model is the most famous paper in this literature, it's called the Baduri. Some people call it the Baduri-Marglin model. Marglin, we were discussing, like we had an exchange a couple of years ago, and he called this paper, he sent me some comments, and he said, this is the Keynes-Harrod-Robinson growth model, right? So different names. One can also find this model, right? Find this closure if you start from the circuit of capital model of Marx in the volume 2 of Capital. So Duncan Foley and Dipankar Basu from UMass, that they have formalized this model, and you can arrive to this sort of closure given these ideas, right? So it's a more generic model than some people think. Within this model, like a natural question to ask if you have this exogenous distribution based on institutions and social norms is, well, what happens to macroeconomic activity if I change distribution, right? And this is the famous question of wage and profit-led growth, or wage and profit-led demand. So distribution has different effects on different components of demand, right? And therefore, the effect of a redistribution of income is not a priori certain. So an increase in the profit share here, the profit share, following my teacher Lance Taylor at the New School, is pi. Somebody told me that it's a very strange choice. Indeed, pi has a very different meaning for most of the world than the profit share. But anyway, if the profit share increases, what happens? Well, consumption will tend to decrease because of the differential saving rate of the different classes, right? It's a stylized fact from the early capitalism that rich save more than the poor, and therefore if you increase the profit share, consumption will tend to decrease. The profit share, an increase in the profit share means increase in the profitability, so investment will tend to increase. It's not certain what happens to net exports. It depends on how the profit share, how this change will come about. But anyway, the idea is that a redistribution of income, an increase in the profit share, has uncertain effects. If the effect on investment, if the positive effect on investment and net exports dominates the negative effect of consumption, this will have an overall positive effect on macroeconomic activity. This is the profit-led demand. On the other case, we have wage-led demand. Now, if we want to be a little bit more formal, this is the basic accounting identity that investment plus net exports plus government deficit is equal to saving. Usually in growth models, we are not having the variables in levels, but we divide them either with a level of labor or capital. So if you divide this with a level with the capital stock, you end up with this equation. So this is the accumulation rate, which depends on the profit share and utilization. This is net exports normalized by the capital stock, and so on. So if you have this equation and you solve it for the rate of utilization, then you end up with this solution. Again, this is an abstract solution, obviously, where utilization is a function of the profit share, right? And for the reasons I explained before, a priori, the effect, like the derivative here of utilization with respect to the profit share is not certain. And it depends on how these functions here behave. So the higher is the propensity to invest with respect to the profit share, or the higher is the propensity of net exports with respect to the profit share relative to the propensity of savings to the profit share, the more profit-led demand tends to be, right? Another interesting issue that comes out from this discussion, which is, I mean, it's important if you deal with this literature, is that we have to distinguish between the effect of redistribution on demand, on utilization, and the accumulation rate, right? So even if we imagine that utilization is profit-led, right? If we look here at, let's say, the investment function, these partial derivatives here are both positive. So a decrease in the profit share might increase utilization if you have wage-led demand, right? But it's not certain that will also increase the growth rate, because in this function, the first term goes down, the second term goes up. So you need to have a very strong reaction of utilization to the decrease in the profit share for the accumulation rate also to increase. So there is this difference. Okay, so these early contributions that I talked about here, they led to a small industry of empirical papers that appeared after the early 90s. If you are a Kaletskian or structuralist who respect themselves, you have to write at least one paper that tries to estimate the demand regime of an economy. So I did it when in my PhD, and I'm also having another paper now. There are different ways, there are different methods. I don't have time, and I'm not going to go into the details. Two main takeaways from the empirical literature. First, the outcome, the empirical estimation is an unsettled question, right? So they're contradicting results about the regime of the US economy, of the regime of European economies, and so on. A common finding, so if there is a common finding that people tend to agree, is that net exports tend to be profit-led, right? Which raises some interesting questions. It raises some interesting issues related to how we redistribute income. Net exports being profit-led means that if a country individually decreases its wage share, so it increases its inequality, it might be able to pursue export-led growth and growth in general, right? But because if you take all the economies of a region or the world together is a closed economy, if every economy in the world tries to do that, then they will lose this advantage that they might have at an individual level, right? So there is this fallacy of composition here. Some people have called it the race to the bottom, meaning that each country individually has tried to pursue export-led growth, but when everybody does that, then they cannot achieve that. Some other people have called it like a prisoner's dilemma type of equilibrium, where you end up, if you play this strategy, you end up in an inferior equilibrium. And this is important when we think about redistribution, and that there is a coordination aspect in the redistribution of income, if we want to talk about it. Another important issue when we think about wage and profit-led growth is how we think about it over time, right? And most of the theoretical and empirical literature doesn't really talk about time variation of the regimes, right? However, if we think about it, there are several reasons why an economy cannot, like the regime, the distribution-led regime of an economy cannot be a permanent feature. There are logical reasons, like what does it mean that an economy is wage-led? Does it mean that if we push the wage share to 100%, we will achieve the maximum growth rate for this economy? This is, I mean, from a logical point of view, this is absurd. At some point, something will change. There are theoretical reasons, empirical reasons. So as I said, like in the very basic canonical model, the regime of an economy depends on the propensity to invest with respect to the profit share. The higher is the propensity to invest with respect to the profit share, the more profit-led the economy tends to be. But there is, like if we look at the theory of investment, or if we look in the literature of financialization and so on, we know that over the last 40 years, there has been a decoupling between cash flows and realized investment, between realized cash flows and realized investment. obviously this result from that literature implies that over this period of time, the US economy, for example, has become less profit-led or more wage-led, right? Because of that. If we take variations in the regime seriously, we can also produce. So this is a graph from a recent paper of mine. We can also produce cycles of growth and distribution. So the assumption here is that an economy becomes more wage-led as the profit share increases. But then at the same time, distribution is unstable from a mathematical point of view, meaning that as a class, as let's say capitalists become more powerful and they capture a higher share of income, then they're able to further tilt income distribution in their favor. But then at the same time, income distribution depends on the degree of distribution-ledness, not a very nice word, like on how wage or profit-led an economy is. In the sense what? That if an economy is wage-led and you increase the profit share, this will tend to decrease the growth rate, decrease capacity utilization, eventually also decrease the profit rate, right? And therefore, all other things equal, this would be an incentive to have a redistribution of income towards wages, even from the firm's point of view. So if we make these assumptions, we end up with these cycles of growth and distribution, right? Where the economy, here we have that the profit share is increasing, the economy is wage-led. So this lambda here, the purple line is the degree of wage or profit-led. If it's negative, it means that it's profit-led. If it's positive, it means that it's wage-led, right? So when the profit share is increasing, the economy is wage-led, you have a crisis, the economy tends to become more wage-led. This creates a crisis. This leads to a change in the direction of the distribution of income, a boom period, but then eventually a crisis in the other direction, and so on and so forth, right? And one can think about let's say the US economy in the 20th century along these lines. So the crisis of the 30s had to do with the high income inequality of that era. This crisis induced a change in the distribution of income that took place in the 30s and the 40s, right? It contributed to the prosperity of the early post-war period, but at the same time, as you had this increase in the wage share over that period, the economy tended to become more profit-led. Eventually, you had a profitability crisis in the 70s. This profitability crisis induced the change in the distribution of income after that and has led to the current crisis, which obviously it's a crisis of high income inequality. If we take time variation of the regimes seriously, and I think we should, then this also raises some important questions for how we estimate the regimes, right? Because if you run a regression, if you take the data for the whole post-war period and you run a regression, an implicit assumption that you make when you try to estimate a regime is that the regimes are constant over time, right? Some people have tried to address this issue by splitting the sample. So they take the data from 1948 to 2020 in the US, and they say, okay, I estimate my regression for the whole sample, and then I split the sample. So what happens if in the period before 1980 and after 1980? This is a graph from a recent paper of mine, which hopefully with Paul Carrillo, who teaches in Ecuador. Here we estimate, we applied what is called a time-varying parameter structural VAR model, which allows for the estimates to vary continuously over time, right? And here are the effects of a change, an increase in the wage share on the growth rate of the US economy for the period 1951 to 2019. So what we find here is indeed that until the mid-70s, the economy was becoming more profit-led, but starting in the mid-70s, you see that there is a reversal and the regime has more or less become neutral, neither profit-led nor wage-led over the last 15 years or so, right? So this graph shows that indeed the effect, if you allow for the effect to change over time, you find that indeed there are very significant changes of the effect of redistribution on the growth rate over time. Another important discussion, controversy in this literature is related to the rate of capacity utilization, right? And the question is the following: as I showed before, the utilization in this closure is one of the adjustment variables, right? So the question is, okay, if you own a factory and you build this factory and you decide that you will run this factory for 2 shifts every day during the week, and then there is a shock in demand, so there is a crisis, and you run your factory for 1 shift per week, right? In the long run, like after 30 years, if you rebuild this factory, will this decrease in demand play a role on how much you utilize your capital? So will you, in the long run, build a new factory that you will run it for 1 shift, given a demand shock, or again for 2 shifts, right? And usually the theory of utilization is telling you, well, demand does not really play a role in this long run choice of utilization. So there is this is also the neoclassical approach, but this is also the approach of different non-neoclassical authors to capacity utilization. What is the implication if you take this view, that utilization is exogenous to demand? One can approach this issue by using this is the so-called Cambridge equation. So this is the accumulation rate, investment on the left-hand side, and this is savings on the right-hand side, right? So if we assume, again, this is the profit share pie, this is the rate of utilization, and this is the saving rate. Now, if we assume that the saving rate is constant, there are 3 ways out of this problem if you believe that utilization is constant, is exogenous to demand in the long run. One is, again, this involves a different closure. So there are 3 different closures that one can propose. One that has been proposed by some Marxist authors like Dumenil and Levy from Paris is that one can be Keynesian in the short run, but classical in the long run. And by classical in the long run means that we drop the assumption of demand, right? So in the long run, investment becomes endogenous and is determined by savings. The other is the neo-Keynesian closure that was very popular in Cambridge. Nicholas Kaldor and John Robinson, also Kalecki in most of his writings adopted this closure. Okay. That we make distribution endogenous, right? So it's the profit share that becomes endogenous. So we keep demand-led growth. We keep an autonomous role for demand on the left-hand side of the equation, but distribution becomes endogenous in order to create the savings that are necessary for this demand. Another closure that has become sort of popular in the last few years is this Sraffian super multiplier model that is introducing another variable. It's introducing this autonomous demand growth rate. Now, by introducing this autonomous demand, basically they maintain a demand-led closure, but they make investment fully endogenous, right? So this is one way for these Sraffian authors to square the circle and have an exogenous utilization and still maintain a role for demand. Now, for the reasons that I talked about before, I find these closures not convincing. So I think that one should keep the role for demand, a role for demand both in the short and the long run. I think that distribution is mainly determined by institutions and social norms. And when it comes to the super multiplier, there are several issues related to what does it mean for some kinds of expenditure to be autonomous in the long run, and also why should investment be completely endogenous in the long run. In my opinion, and if we look at, there are theoretical arguments, but also if we look at empirical data, the rate of utilization changes significantly over long periods of time, and therefore should not be treated as exogenous, and therefore one can maintain the basic closure that I talked about before. Okay, two final issues. I will just be very quick here and just refer very quickly to this slide. One, when we talk about distribution being exogenous, this is at a high level of abstraction, right? In reality, distribution depends on economic variables, right? So at lower levels of abstraction, distribution depends on economic variables. However, the closure that I refer to as Kaleckian or structuralist and so on remains valid as long as distribution does not become purely endogenous, meaning that distribution is not determined purely by economic variables within the market, right? Related to that, institutions and social norms also mediate how economic variables affect distribution. And then I have this slide, which I will skip now, but we can talk about that in the Q&A afterwards. Two more things. One, another important adjustment variable that I haven't talked about is productivity, right? So the fact that demand has an autonomous role should not lead us to believe that the supply side is not important or productivity is not important, right? In this literature, you have two main theories of technical change that have been employed by people. One is the induced technical change that goes back to Ricardo and Marx, and it's telling us that labor productivity reacts to the cost of labor. So the higher is the cost of labor, the higher is the incentive of capitalists to introduce labor-saving techniques of production. And the other goes back to Smith. It's Gunnar Myrdal has talked about it, and sometimes it's referred to as the Kaldor-Verdun theory of technical change, that is telling you that higher output growth leads to higher growth of labor productivity, right? There has been a lot of discussion about secular stagnation, at least before the pandemic. People were talking a lot about secular stagnation and the slowdown of labor productivity. From a neoclassical point of view, this issue has been approached as an exogenous decrease in labor productivity growth. These theories provide, in my opinion, a more convincing explanation on why productivity has slowed down over the last 30 years or so, right? The slowdown of the growth rate of the real wage and the slowdown of the growth rate of output has contributed to the slowdown of the growth rate of labor productivity. Also, productivity in a demand-led framework opens a whole new set of questions, in the sense that what happens to employment when productivity grows, right? So all other things equal, when productivity increases, demand for labor is decreasing, right? So in a demand-led framework, you need to find the right balance between productivity growth, but at the same time, growth in demand to sustain high levels of employment. And this is my last slide. So 2 more minutes and I'm done. So I talked about this, this approach of demand-led growth and income distribution. One point I would need to emphasize is that this model and this approach should be taken within a wider, let's say, structuralist framework, right? So the fact that demand plays a role does not mean, as I said before, that supply does not have a role. It does have a role, right? But more generally, at a more concrete level, we also need to pay close attention to institutions, the social norms of the economy, the structural characteristics of the economy, and so on and so forth. Right? So, for example, if we want to think about concrete economic problems, we need to ask, okay, what is the structural, the sectoral decomposition of economic activity? Right? Because again, if you start talking about different sectors, then different sectors might have different closures, and this raises a new set of questions afterwards, right? For example, Kalecki famously in his 1953 talk in Mexico, he had said, well, output can accommodate demand in developed economies, right? But when we're talking about developing economies face severe supply constraint in the agricultural sector. So in developing economies, if you start pushing aggregate demand too much, this would lead to, this would hit the supply constraints in the agricultural sector, increase the price of food, and this will have very significant, welfare implications for these countries. Or another set of questions is, well, okay, we redistribute income, we increase the wage share. The wage share is not a policy variable. How do we do that? And what are the different ways to redistribute income? And then think about, well, what is the effect of each of these ways on economic activity? So I will stop here, and we can talk more about this stuff in the Q&A. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michalis, the participant of the summer school. If you actually do go to the reading list and find his papers and the papers that he suggested as readings, you'll see the very sophisticated research work that he does. But I am also always amazed by the clarity that he has when he explains these things, and especially when he teaches them. So if any one of you wants to continue studying economics, I would definitely suggest to look into his program, the program where he teaches here at the University of Geneva, where also other great economists are teaching, including Mary O'Sullivan, a fantastic economic historian whose work I truly admire. So please do take a look at that. And thank you very much, Michalis. Can you just pass me this? That's fine. I can just do this. Oh. And I would like to follow up, connecting a bit what he was saying, what he's been saying with the some of the work we do here. Can I have the presentation mode again? I'll do it. Well, let's say it very directly. Most standard models used by international organizations are constructed around the neoclassical principles that Michalis just described. And those include, for sure, the flexible system of global models of IMF, the going for growth framework of OECD, the Quest model of the European Commission. So they all suffer of those problems that he described in his talk. When I joined INET in 2015, that was my previous job before coming here. And in 2016, as you know, there was a wave of populist, so-called populist governments taking power in the US and in the UK. And at the time, the president of INET, Rob Johnson, asked me to curate a series of short articles on, the title was Experts on Trial, because the idea was that how come that, people vote for political parties that are self-proclaimed anti-establishment, precisely because there is this idea that experts do not really tell the truth, are cheating us, and they're not giving us the right prescription or right suggestions in terms of economic policies. And as part of this series, I asked Alex Izurieta, who happens to be the leading modeler here at the UN, at DESA first and UNCTAD now, to write a piece precisely on how come that these models that international organizations use keep failing their projections, as Michalis just explained very well, but they keep being used and they don't get really questioned. They get questions in a populistic way sometimes, but they don't really get questions, and they keep being used. And so I knew I would eventually come here and work with him, but already at the time I found his response in this essay that is still online on the INET website, if you're interested. His response very interesting, and he brought up this quote you can see here explains that the problem of appealing narratives that support mathematical sophistications applied to modeling, and those two elements mutually reinforce each other in a vicious circle, and that allows also to go past the obvious failure of the projection, the systematic obvious failure that these projections happen to go through. So what narratives are we talking about, for example? Michalis mentioned already a few, but all the sophisticated discussion he described that should happen when we distinguish between profit-led or wage-led regime, what drives investment, what drives profits? Well, in a neoclassical narrative, it's pretty easy. Deregulation, patents, increasing patents, decreasing taxation, creating a business-friendly environment, and that's it. And that's the narrative that lies behind the assumption that are at the core of this type of modeling. Even worse, is something I've studied myself extensively, that the idea that we shouldn't really look at actual employment or actual output or actual employment. We should look at potential output and potential employment. Problem is potential output and employment are not observable, so we have to model them, to estimate them based on a series of assumptions. And what happens is that if potential output is not demand-led, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that if you cannot increase your fiscal support to the economy, then income will fall. So you have what happens is that in practice, the way to estimate potential output is an ex post moving average of actual output. So whatever happens to the economy, because you're not giving the right policy advice in terms of fiscal policy, is that the economy, the rate of growth falls, that income, unemployment rate goes up, and that reinforces the prediction of potential output and potential employment rate. These are the European Commission's estimates in 2013. So at the height of the European debt crisis, for the narrow, so the non-accelerating wage rate of unemployment. And you see that essentially they are saying you cannot spend one dime more because your level of unemployment, rate of unemployment, is your potential level of unemployment, and you cannot, any effort to reduce it would be inflationary. There's the output gap is essentially zero, and sometimes it's even negative, with unemployment rates that are above 10%. And so again, what are the social implications of all this? All narratives and problematic models and assumptions that go together to mutually reinforce. Another example that I've been studying since I arrived here, is that sustainability framework. So you have the neoclassical theory behind it that has been celebrated as, for example, recent works by Blanchard, as opening up more room for fiscal spending and for deficit spending and for increasing debt the indebtedness. Because as long as the growth rate is higher than the interest rate, that doesn't lead to a continuous increase in the debt to income ratio. That of course is all very theoretical, because in these models there are forward-looking models. You have an infinite horizon. You have specific hypotheses that in the end mean that you essentially can spend as much as you want in reality, because there is no formal target. And what matters is the average over time of your deficits and surpluses. So if it's an infinite horizon, at any point, even like in 100 years, you can have a very high surplus that compensates your deficits in the previous 100 years. But when this theory gets moved into the very practical model that the IMF and the World Bank use to do their debt sustainability assessment, it becomes all the neoclassical assumptions become very important, because they, of course, need to put a target either in terms of debt to income ratio and in terms of timing. Like, for example, this country needs to reach that debt to income ratio in 5 years. So, and when you have that type of targets, all those assumptions in the model that say that you cannot, that if you spend too much, that is going to be inflationary, become extremely relevant. And so, and that becomes a problem. So I said most international organizations, except one, the UN, we do have a demand-led global model, the UN Global Policy Model, which allows us to do to actually quite systematically reach opposite to this, results and conclusions that all other models of the international organizations. This is just a screenshot of the press clip for TDR 2022, where we modeled regional, what we call the South-led way scenario with the regional arrangements, both in terms of trade targets and financial cooperation. And we are also able to look at the effects in policy in scenarios over time on, for example, CO2 emission, like this screenshot shows. So why is this a different model? Just very briefly, and picking up on what Michalis described much better, the two main propositions is that the main constraint faced by an economy is insufficient aggregate demand, and technical progress is usually a response to sustained increase in aggregate demand. Okay. So one important aspect is that it's not like our model doesn't use assumptions. We are quite aware that any models have huge limitations, of course. And in fact, we refuse to make projections. I mean, to make forecasts, we make projections on current year and the following year. But then beyond that, we exclusively run policy scenarios. So scenarios that are contingent on assumptions of what policies could be run or would be run. So typically we run a baseline scenario with business as usual kind of policies, and a different scenario with a type of policies that we would like to test and see, given all a set of external conditions, what they could lead to. So those are not, importantly, we try to be methodologically conscious in terms of not doing forecasts the way other organizations do. And the other important, so what the other important thing is that you know, we've seen there are different type of closures, there are different type of models, and they're not always incompatible mutually. Depends what you're trying to explain and what you're trying to do with it. So the global models like this, which is a very big model that comprises the entire world economy, is useful to understand interdependence, which is the core, one of the core economic principles on which UNCTAD is based. Okay, so the fact that no country is alone, and as Michalis mentioned, there's often a problem of fallacy of composition, of whether one country is behaving a certain way, expecting that the rest of the world will just absorb their exports, for example. And so a global model allows to take into account for all these feedback effects in interactions, and allows to, for example, a developing countries to say, well, it's not just about my policies, it's also about what the US is doing. So I should be able to question that, and I should be able, and anyone who's questioning my policies should take that into account. Okay. And of course, it relies on assumptions. So what it means that it relies on other theoretical empirical work, on other models. And it's very important that other models exist and feed this type of work. The problem, so there are limitations. The problem is when there are obvious mistake or obvious and voluntary distortions that feed into wrong and distortive narratives. And a lot of brain power goes into these models with extreme, mathematical sophistication that produce distorted results because of their assumption and their basic construction. So what I'm trying to say here is we need a lot of work, not just in modeling, policy modeling, but in all type of economic research, history of thought, economic history, institutional analysis, different type of models that can reinforce whatever, much simplified, of course, in many ways, the global policy model can do. And we try to do, I had another slide. Okay, never mind. It takes a village, and it takes and the world needs, I cannot say it more strongly, it needs urgently all the brain power that you and we have in order to reinforce positive narratives and non-distortive narratives in terms of economic policies.